Hey everyone, Sam here. Thanks for joining me. In this video I'm going to show you how to paint this rural landscape, and I'm going to give you some specific tips on how we can create depth in our paintings and how to make those distant landforms recede by desaturating our colours. Now lately I've been outdoors painting on plein air a lot, so this painting started off as an outdoor painting and then I finished it in the studio by adding more detail to it. So the first part of the video is me painting outdoors, and then the second part of the video is me finishing the painting in the studio. And again, I've been getting out in my local area and just loving painting outside, and it was also a chance for me to try out my new pochade box, which was really cool. Now if you're an artist or creative and you'd like to make a website, then check out portfoliobox.net. Portfolio Box is an online website builder where you can create your own stunning website to showcase your work to the highest standard. There's lots of different templates and styles to choose from, and you don't need to know any coding. The whole thing works through drop and drag. Now, right now, Portfolio Box is offering a 50% discount on any of their plans for the first year, simply by typing in the discount code SAMERP50, and I've put the link and discount code in the description box below. You can actually start building your website right away, and then when you want to take it live, that's when you choose the plan that you wish to purchase. So there's a free trial there if you'd like to see how it all works to start with. Anyway, it's all there in the description box below. Check it out, portfoliobox.net. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Sit back, relax, and let's roll the tape. So I'm out in my local area in Northland, New Zealand, and I just love painting these rolling green hills and trees. And if you've watched some of my YouTube videos lately, you'll see that I've been painting out here a lot. And that's partly because it's been winter and we're that little bit further north. It's very green at this time of year, and I just love painting these types of landscapes, so I've been painting out here a lot. But the other reason I've come out here today to paint outdoors is I want to try my new Alla Prima pochade box. And this is made by a guy called Ben Haggett, who lives in Montana in the USA, and he hand makes all of these. So this is the Belly River Light model, and this is the smallest of the pochade boxes. So it's designed ideally for 6x8 panels, but you can also paint 8x10s on them. And it mounts on a camera tripod, and if I open it up here, there's a paint palette. This, you can clip that to the side there, and then there's storage spaces for panels in the top. But the other thing I really like about this is it's really small, so I think this will be ideal for traveling. So that's part of the reason I've got this one. But I can't wait to try it out anyway. I'm going to paint this view over there. If you'd like to learn more about these pochade boxes, I've put a link in the description below to Ben's website. Right, so I've got my pochade box all set up. I'm painting on an 8x10 panel here. And the colours I'm using is titanium white, some burnt sienna, yellow oxide, cadmium yellow, quinacridone magenta, ultramarine blue, cobalt teal, and phthalo green. And I'm using oil paint, so this is liquid, which is an alkyd resin, and it just speeds up the drying time as well as improving the flow of the paint. So this is a really useful medium for when you're painting outdoors. So yeah, I think I'm all ready to go. Got everything all set up. Let's get painting. I'm painting on an 8x10 linen panel. It's a pre-made panel, and it's medium weave linen that's mounted to Baltic birch. Now what I did earlier on in the studio was I prepared a load of these panels with a wash of burnt sienna. So it's completely dry when I paint on it, but that burnt sienna is going to give the painting a nice glow as it comes through the paint layers. It also helps with your colours and values, and it gives the painting an overall traditional feel. I begin sketching out my composition with a number 1 round brush, and I'm using burnt sienna that's dipped in some of that liquid that I put on the palette there. Now I'm keeping this landscape simple as I want to communicate space within the painting but also capture the atmosphere of the afternoon. I've added one of these tortura trees in the foreground on the left side of the painting to give the artwork a sense of scale. The other thing I wanted to communicate was a nice vista of fields as far as the eye can see. Now before I start applying any colour, the first thing I do is look out on the landscape and identify where all the dark values and shadows are within the landscape that I'm painting. I learned this from some other plein air painters, and for me I think there's no doubt that I find it easiest to start my painting by establishing all the dark values and shadows first. Value just refers to how light or dark a subject is. Now if you watched any of my other videos, you probably hear me say this every time and I probably sound like a stuck record, but I think repetition really helps. So we're starting with the darkest values and shadows first, and I'm going to start with the furthest zone in the landscape, and that's the sky and clouds. I start by painting the cloud shadows as this is the lightest of the shadows in the landscape. Now I'm keeping the mix simple and it's just ultramarine blue with some burnt sienna and titanium white, and you can create some really nice natural looking greys with these colours. Now once I've marked in a few of those cloud shadows, I then move on to the next darkest shadows, and those are the trees in the distant fields. Now trees are some of the darkest values you're likely to find in the landscape, but as these ones are so far away, the value of these trees is going to appear much lighter. Also, as they're so far away, the colour of the trees will have completely dropped out, so we need to use a desaturated colour. So what I do here is actually I use the same colours that I used for the cloud shadow mix, but use less titanium white. I also use a little bit more ultramarine blue in the mix just to edge it on the blue side. Now as I work forward in the painting, those main shadows are still occurring within the trees, and because the trees are the darkest values in the landscape, those shadows are getting darker. This is because we'll find our darkest darks and our lightest lights in the foreground. I mix the colours for the tree shadows with ultramarine blue and a little yellow oxide because I still want a green element in there. I create a nice dark tone with these two colours and use that to paint the shadows in the tortura tree in the foreground. I then take the same two colours and mix in a little bit of titanium white just to make the value lighter, and I begin painting the shadows in the trees in the midground. Yellow is a naturally light value colour, so when you mix this to make your greens, it's going to make the value of the colour lighter, so at this stage I don't use too much yellow oxide. And then following that I paint the shadows in the grass, especially where the trees are casting shadows. Now grass is a lighter value you'll find in the landscape, and it's much lighter than the value of the trees. And this is really important to remember because otherwise the trees would not stand out in your painting if the values are the same. So trees are generally the darkest values you'll find in the landscape, grass is always much lighter. So in this case what I've done is I've taken my existing tree shadow mix that I used for those trees in the midground, and then I've just introduced a little bit of cobalt teal into the mix as well, just to make it a little bit more green. So all up I've been using ultramarine blue, yellow oxide, a little cobalt teal and a little titanium white. Now by marking in the shadow areas first, we can straight away see what the tonal dynamic is likely to look like within the painting. And I'd apply the exact same method if I was starting a painting from scratch in the studio. I always start off my dark values first. Once I've marked in all my dark areas, I then go straight back to the sky and clouds, and I start painting in some of those cloud highlights. For the cloud highlights I'm just mixing titanium white with a little bit of burnt sienna, and this is going to blend in nicely with the cloud shadows as I've already used these two colours in my cloud shadow mix. Following that I begin painting the sky, and this is a mix of ultramarine blue with a little cobalt teal and titanium white. Now if you don't have cobalt teal you can use phthalo green instead, but you'll need only a very small amount because it's a strong colour. The upper portion of the sky is going to be a little darker and a bit more saturated, but then as the sky heads towards the horizon, it's going to become lighter. Now there's also some of that hazy high level cloud in the distance as well, so I leave a gap here and I just mark that in with some titanium white mixed with a little bit of burnt sienna. So I've loosely marked in the sky, and the next area to work on are those fields in the distance. But how do we make those greens look like they're far away? Well, what we need to do here is desaturate the colour. Greens and yellows as wavelengths don't tend to travel well over long distances, and our eyes can trick us into thinking that it's really green when it's not. So this is an important thing to remember when you're painting landscapes. To create this colour, I mix yellow oxide with a little ultramarine blue, titanium white, and also a very small amount of cobalt teal. And this is because the grass is more of an emerald green colour. Now the yellow oxide has a low tinting strength, and it's not a particularly high chroma colour, chroma being another word for saturation. It also contains red as well, which is the colour opposite to green on the colour wheel, so this helps with the desaturation process, especially when I mix in titanium white with it. So we need to keep this green desaturated in order for it to sit back in the landscape. Then as we come forward in the painting, we can start increasing the saturation of the green. So here I'm using the same colours, but I'm introducing some cadmium yellow, which is going to increase the saturation. If it's looking a little too green, I can just harmonise the colour a bit by mixing in some quinacridone magenta, as the red in this colour is opposite to green on the colour wheel and it's going to desaturate it. So my base mixes for these greens is mainly yellow oxide, ultramarine blue and titanium white. And then when I want to increase the saturation, I start introducing cobalt teal, cadmium yellow, and even a little phthalo green, but I've just reserved this for the foreground grass area. Now I'll show you how to mix a couple of these greens on my palette later on in the video when I'm back in the studio painting. Now at the moment I've been using a mix of number 5 flat brushes just to cover ground more quickly, but also number 3 filbert brushes, as these have a nice rounded edge to them, so I can get some finer marks. Once I've got in that grass, I then work on the trees in the midground, keeping in mind, as I said before, that these are some of the darkest values in the painting. So even the foliage of these conifer trees in the full sunlight is not going to appear particularly bright. So I've just used a mix of yellow oxide with some ultramarine blue and a little bit of titanium white. There's a few gum trees in the midground as well, so I've also mixed in a little bit of burnt sienna into my mix for those gum tree leaves. For the foliage on the tortora tree in the foreground on the left, I've again used ultramarine blue with yellow oxide, but used a lot more yellow oxide in my mix this time. I've also used a tiny amount of phthalo green. Once I've marked in all these basic colours within the main zones in the painting, I then just go back across the whole thing and just tidy it up, filling in some of those gaps between the clouds, for example, and filling in some of these zones around the trees. I also restate the darks where necessary and basically just make the whole painting come together. I finish up the plein air part of this painting by just adding in a few shadows in the grass in the foreground, and this just helps to communicate more depth and a time of day within the painting. For this I've again mixed ultramarine blue with a little yellow oxide. Now when I came out painting today, I did say to myself that I was just going to leave this as a plein air painting, test out my new Pochard box, and yeah, leave it as a plein air painting basically. But I think I'm going to add some detail to it in the studio. Okay, so I'm back in the studio now, and with this painting I'm just going to be adding a bit more detail to it and generally tidying the whole thing up. I often find that some of these more simple landscapes make great paintings, so I don't want to overcomplicate it either. Now the first thing I do when I start this painting in the studio is I start with the furthest zone away, and that's the sky. And what I've done here is I've just gone over some of those cloud highlights using the same colours that I was using when I was out painting on plein air. So just a mix of titanium white with some burnt sienna. I'm also using the same colours for the cloud shadows as I did when I was painting outdoors, and this was a mix of ultramarine blue with some burnt sienna and titanium white. And as I said before, when burnt sienna and ultramarine blue are combined with titanium white, you can make some really nice neutral greys with them. And this is because burnt sienna is a dark orange. So when it's combined with ultramarine blue, blue being opposite to orange on the colourwheel, the two cancel each other out when combined. I've switched to using number 3 filbert brushes. Again, I really like that nice rounded edge because I can get a range of marks with them, using the broad end of the brush or the flat end of the brush. And then when I've marked in and shaped some of those clouds there, I'm then able to further define the shapes of the clouds by filling in the negative spaces around them, which is the sky. Here I've added a few little bit more saturated areas within the sky just to indicate some gaps within that hazy high level cloud. It's also going to add a bit of texture to the sky overall. Again, I've used the same colours that I used earlier on, and it's a mix of ultramarine blue with a little cobalt teal and titanium white. I've definitely gone a little heavier on the ultramarine blue. So now I'm returning to those distant fields, and as I said earlier on, I need to keep those colours much lower in chroma and more desaturated. And those values within the shadows need to be much lighter than the shadows within the foreground. The first thing I do here is restate some of those trees that are within the very distance. The colour of these trees will have dropped right out at this distance, so what I've done here is I've mixed ultramarine blue with burnt sienna and titanium white, but I've used a bit more ultramarine blue in the mix. Now as I've used these colours in the cloud shadows and in the clouds in general, that ties these two zones together, so it makes the painting more harmonious. So now that I've arrived here at the midground, I'm going to start introducing a green element into those tree shadows. And the same as before, a mix of ultramarine blue with some yellow oxide and a little bit of titanium white to get the value that I want. For the areas of those midground trees that are in light, I've mixed yellow oxide with ultramarine blue, a little quinacridone magenta and some titanium white. And then I've been applying this mix with a number 3 filbert brush. Following that, I start working in more texture into the grass in the midground. Now here the saturation of the grass is much more increased than the fields in the distance. I start with a mix of yellow oxide and ultramarine blue, and then I start turning up the volume of that colour, increasing the saturation by mixing in some cadmium yellow. A little bit of cobalt teal in the mix just shifts that hue to a more emerald green, and then I can make the value a little lighter by mixing in some titanium white. For the grass in the very foreground, this is where I was using some of my most saturated greens. And you can turn up the volume of the saturation of your greens to 11 by mixing in a little phthalo green. But be careful though, because this colour is strong stuff and you'll only need a small amount. Phthalo green's not really a colour that I'd ever use on its own, it's always a colour that I mix into an existing green that I've just made just to kick up the saturation a little bit. Now if your green's looking a little too cold, then you can always add a red element to the mix, and I do this by mixing in some quinacridone magenta in this case. You only need a small amount, but it just helps to harmonise that green and make it look more organic. Now one of the things I did here when I was adding more layers to the fields was I removed a group of trees there that I felt was cluttering the composition a little bit, so I got rid of them just to create a bit more space within the middle of the painting. I begin working on the tortora tree that's on the left side in the foreground, and again I'm just restate the shadows and start working in a bit more detail. Now, as I said before, because we're right in the foreground here and these trees are naturally dark in value, this is where we're going to find our darkest darks, within the shadows of the tree's crown. Then following that, I start adding some more colour into the areas of the tree's foliage that's in the full sunlight, keeping in mind that this green is much darker than the grass. I've mostly used the same colours that I've used in the grass, so yellow oxide with ultramarine blue, then cadmium yellow to increase the saturation, and I've also added in a small amount of cadmium orange, as many of these trees have an olive coloured foliage. Now, even though we're in the southern hemisphere at the top of New Zealand pretty much, bordering on the subtropics, we still have a lot of European deciduous trees that have been introduced here. So in this particular landscape there's lots of black poplars, Lombardy poplars, crack willows and red oaks. So at the time I was painting this, which was towards the end of the winter, all those trees have lost their leaves. So many of these trees, especially the black poplars, have quite light coloured bark, especially in the main stems and twigs. And these are going to provide a nice balance to the trees within the painting. It's also going to break up some of those stands of trees and add interest to the painting overall. So to mix the colour for the twigs and main stems, I've just used a mix of titanium white with some burnt sienna, a little yellow oxide and a very small amount of quinacridone magenta. And then for the shadow areas within these trees, I've just introduced some ultramarine blue and more burnt sienna into the mix. At this stage in the painting, I just allowed the whole thing to dry so that I could then add a few final details that will finish the painting. So what I've done here is add a few highlights to the tortora tree in the foreground, using the same colours I was using before but with a little bit more titanium white. And now I'm using a number 0 synthetic round brush which has got a nice fine point to it. I use a 1/4 inch bristle dagger brush for the grass in the foreground to communicate clumps of grass that you'd find in a meadow. I then use another number 0 synthetic round brush to paint the suggestion of a few stems and branches within the tortora tree and some of those other deciduous trees that are in the midground. And again, it was the same colours that I used previously, so a mix of titanium white with just burnt sienna and a little yellow oxide this time. And then I just paint the suggestion of main stems, branches and twigs. I complete the painting by just adding a few cows in the midground, which just adds some life into the overall story of this painting. I then finish the painting by just adding a few more details here and there, and just tidying up the various zones within the painting, such as the sky and clouds for example. This is a pretty simple landscape, but I really enjoyed painting this one. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Also, please leave me a comment in the comment section below. Now, if you'd like to learn more about painting, then check out the painting resources I have on my website at samuelerp.com. I've got lots of free written painting tutorials and reference photos that you can copy if you'd like to have a go at painting it yourself. I also have full-length painting tutorial videos for sale available from my website, and you can get instant access to all of those videos by subscribing to me on Patreon for just $5 a month. You get instant access to all of my videos and a new painting video every month. Now, just a quick note, depending on where you are in the world, Patreon may apply sales tax, and unfortunately this is out of my control. There's nothing I can do about this. It's all related to various government laws, but I hope that doesn't stop you from checking out the awesome content that's on Patreon that's there to help you improve your painting skills. I share all my knowledge with each painting that I do. Now if you'd like to see what artworks I'm working on at the moment, then you can follow me on Instagram and Facebook, and you can also see my latest artwork on my other website, samuellafineart.com, which is there just to show my paintings. And this is built on the Portfolio Box platform, so if you're looking to build a website, then check out portfoliobox.net. And at the moment they're offering a 50% discount on any plan for the first year, and I've put all the links and the discount code in the description box below. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. Have a beautiful day, and I shall see you in the next video.